Dexter Morgan spent 8 seasons killing people in Miami while working inside the police department that was supposed to catch him. In season 2, divers stumbled onto his underwater dumping ground by accident. 18 bodies come up, wrapped the same way, cut apart in a way that points to real forensic knowledge. The FBI sends Special Agent Frank Lundy, a man with a reputation for solving cases nobody else can crack. He builds a task force. He still closes the case on the wrong man, Sergeant James Dokes, framed by evidence Dexter planted himself. The real killer keeps his badge and keeps killing for 6 more seasons. Nobody has priced out what the manhunt actually cost. Not the drama, the dollar figure. What does it cost the federal government to run a task force, pull bodies out of the ocean, identify 18 victims, and still fail? Well, here's the number. Frank Lundy is a veteran with a national reputation, which puts him well above entry-level pay. FBI special agents are paid on the federal general schedule, and a senior agent at the GS-14 level earns a base salary between roughly $93,000 and $121,000 a year. Add the mandatory 25% availability pay that all special agents receive in place of overtime, and that becomes roughly $116,000 to $151,000 a year before locality adjustments for a city like Miami. Lundy doesn't work alone. The show has him calling in several additional FBI special agents once he determines the killer is someone inside law enforcement. A realistic team for a case this size would run 5 to 6 field agents at the GS-13 level, paying roughly $98,000 to $128,000 a year, including availability pay. On top of that, Miami Metro pulls its own detectives onto the task force full-time. Dexter Morgan, Angel Batista, and the others who get reassigned away from their regular caseload. Municipal homicide detectives in a major metro department typically earn $70,000 to $90,000 annually. Even Vince Masuka, the department's forensic tech, gets pulled onto the joint task force as lead forensics investigator, which the show treats as a promotion, but which really just means his existing salary now gets billed against the specific case overhead rather than the department's general budget. None of these people work for free, and none of them are working a normal 40-hour week during an active serial killer investigation. The show's own dialogue places the case at a minimum of several weeks, with other details in the season suggesting the active task force period ran closer to a few months before Dokes is named the prime suspect. Using a conservative 4-month window for the calculation, Lundy's salary alone cost $39,000 to $50,000 for that stretch. 5 additional FBI agents add $163,000 to $213,000. 4 Miami Metro detectives pulled onto the task force add roughly $93,000 to $120,000 more. There's also the overhead that comes with standing up a joint task force in the first place. Office space at Miami Metro dedicated to the investigation, secure phone lines, a command structure separate from the department's regular workflow. That kind of administrative setup for a temporary multi-agency task force realistically adds another $10,000 to $20,000 across the life of the case. So right now our running total is $305,000 to $403,000. And nobody has pulled a single body out of the water yet. If you like this kind of number crunching on shows you already know by heart, subscribe. This channel breaks down the parts of these stories nobody else bothers to actually calculate. The task force is just the people. What happens next is where things get expensive fast, because 18 bodies do not recover themselves. Once the bodies are found, a full-scale underwater recovery operation begins. Public safety dive teams that specialize in this kind of work use sonar equipment, remotely operated vehicles for deep or low visibility search areas, and dedicated dive boats, all staffed by officers trained specifically for underwater forensic recovery. This is not a job that gets rushed. Every bag has to be located, documented in place, and brought up carefully enough to preserve it as evidence for a future trial. Divers working a scene like this typically operate in what's known as black water, meaning zero visibility, which means most of the work is done by feel rather than sight, and every single bag recovery has to be treated as its own careful operation rather than a batch job. A multi-day marine recovery operation of this scale, factoring in personnel overtime, boat fuel, and the use of specialized sonar and ROV equipment, realistically runs $8,000 to $15,000 per operational day. Given the number of bags recovered and the level of care needed to catalog each one, this likely took 8 to 12 days of active recovery work spread across the investigation. That puts the dive operation cost between $64,000 and $180,000. Then there's the morgue. The show describes a large, air-conditioned field morgue tent built specifically for this case because the volume of remains was too much for the standard medical examiner's office to handle on its own. Standing up a temporary, refrigerated morgue of that size, generators, rolling tables, biohazard containment, and staff working around the clock realistically cost $50,000 to $80,000 for a case of this scale and duration. That figure covers the physical structure and its operation, not the actual forensic work being done inside it, which comes with its own separate cost. Then there's also transport to consider. Getting 18 sets of remains from the recovery site to the field morgue, then eventually to wherever long-term storage or burial happens, requires refrigerated transport vehicles and trained personnel to handle chain of custody at every step. That adds a further $10,000 to $20,000 across the case. So our running total for all of this alone is $124,000 to $280,000, bringing our cumulative total to $429,000 to $683,000. Now, recovering the bodies is step one. Figuring out who all 18 of them actually are costs just as much, if not more. Every body needs an autopsy, and every body needs an identification, which at this stage of decomposition usually means DNA and dental work rather than a simple visual ID. A forensic autopsy conducted for a criminal investigation, as opposed to a routine hospital procedure, typically costs $2,000 to $7,000 per body once you account for the detailed examination and the court-ready documentation a case like this requires. Across 18 confirmed victims, that's $36,000 to $126,000 just for the autopsies themselves. DNA identification adds another layer entirely. Processing a case through a forensic lab, from initial evidence intake to a confirmed identification, generally runs $800 to $2,400, depending on how degraded the sample is after time spent in the water. Across 18 victims, that adds another $14,400 to $43,200. The show also has Dexter's own blood slide collection yield 12 additional confirmed victims once investigators get their hands on it, expanding the case well past the original 18. Running DNA comparisons and partial identifications against those slide samples adds a further $9,600 to $28,800 in lab costs. And none of this counts the dental records work needed to confirm identities where DNA alone isn't enough, or the time spent tracking down and notifying next of kin across what eventually becomes a list of 30 names. A realistic figure for dental record retrieval, comparison, and the administrative work of notification across a case this size adds another $10,000 to $20,000. So our running total for this section is anywhere from $70,000 to $218,000, bringing our cumulative total to $499,000 all the way up to $901,000. Now, drop a comment below. Which part of this investigation do you think actually cost the FBI the most in the end? The manhunt itself, or closing the case on the wrong man? Identifying the dead is one problem. Finding the person responsible while he sits 3 feet away in the same building is a completely different kind of expensive. This is where the case gets personal, because Lundy actually starts closing in on the location where the real killer operates. The show has them installing security cameras at Coral Cove Marina, the low security dock where Dexter happens to keep his boat, specifically because it fits the profile of where a careful, methodical killer would choose to work. A commercial-grade surveillance system with multiple cameras, night vision capability, and ongoing monitoring for an active federal investigation realistically costs $8,000 to $18,000 to install and maintain for the length of the case. Lundy also runs background checks throughout the investigation. The show depicts him pulling a full background check on Deborah's boyfriend, Gabriel, just to rule him out personally, which gives a sense of how routinely this tool gets used across a case like this. A formal background investigation involving criminal history, financial records, and employment verification typically costs a few $100s in direct fees per person once law enforcement database access and analyst time are factored in. Across a case with this many persons of interest, Dokes, several of the Bay Harbor Butcher's victims known associates, and a handful of secondary suspects who get looked at and cleared, a realistic total for background work across the investigation runs $8,000 to $15,000. Then there's the legal side. Getting the warrant to search Dokes' car at the airport, along with every other search warrant, subpoena, and filing the case generates, requires coordination with a federal prosecutor's office, attorney and paralegal time for warrant preparation and court filings across a multi-month task force investigation realistically adds another $20,000 to $35,000. And surveillance doesn't stop at the marina either. A case of this profile typically involves phone record requests, financial record subpoenas on persons of interest, and coordination with other law enforcement databases to cross-reference known associates of the victim. That kind of record-based investigative work, billed at standard analyst and agent hourly rates across the life of a case, adds a further $15,000 to $25,000. So for this portion, our running total is $51,000 to $93,000, with a cumulative total of $550,000 to $994,000. All of that spending, and the case still lands on the wrong man. The last piece shows what that mistake is actually worth once you compare it to real investigations of this size. This is the part that never shows up on a line item budget, but it's the most honest number in the whole breakdown. Real Serial Killer Task Force gives us something to measure this against. The Green River Killer investigation in Washington state ran for 19 years, involved dozens of investigators at its peak, and burned through roughly $15 million in public money before Gary Ridgway was finally identified through DNA, a case tied to 49 confirmed victims. The BTK investigation in Wichita, Kansas spanned decades and consumed over 100,000 investigator hours between 1974 and 1991 alone, described by police at the time as costing hundreds of thousands of dollars in man-hours, travel, and phone records before the case finally broke in 2005. The Bay Harbor Butcher Task Force isn't anywhere near that scale and duration. It runs for months, not decades. But the intensity is comparable for the time it's active. Multiple federal agents, a full homicide unit reassigned, a dedicated field morgue, and around-the-clock overtime, all compressed into a short, high-pressure window instead of stretched across years. On top of the base salaries already counted, the extended hours detectives like Deborah and Batista put in canvassing marinas, chasing leads, and building the case against Dokes once he becomes the prime suspect realistically adds another $45,000 to $75,000 in labor costs that don't show up as a clean line item anywhere. So for this section, we can add $45,000 to $75,000, bringing our cumulative total from a lower range of $595,000 to the upper range of $1,069,000. Now, let's itemize everything. Task force personnel across 4 months, $305,000 to $403,000. Recovery operation and field morgue, $124,000 to $280,000. Autopsies, DNA, and identification work across 30 confirmed victims, $70,000 to $218,000. Surveillance, background checks, and legal coordination, $51,000 to $93,000. And extra labor costs beyond base salary, $45,000 to $75,000. On the low end, that puts us roughly at $585,000. And at the high end, roughly $1,069,000. Call the realistic middle of that range $800,000. Compare that to Green River, $15 million across 49 victims, or about $306,000 per confirmed victim. The Bay Harbor Butcher case runs somewhere around $27,000 to $35,000 per victim, which makes it one of the cheaper serial killer investigations on this list by a wide margin. It is also one of the only ones that got the wrong man. Green River and BTK both ended with the correct suspect behind bars. This one ends with James Dokes' name permanently attached to a crime he never committed, and Dexter Morgan still clocking in at Miami Metro the following Monday. The FBI spent close to $1 million, built a full multi-agency task force, and put cameras on the killer's own marina slip. It still closed the file on the wrong name and never found out. If this changed how close you thought the FBI actually got, subscribe and hit the bell. The next breakdown goes just as deep.